Hello, my name is Jay and welcome back to my Tech Vault. Today we're going to be talking about why the X570 chipset is so much more expensive than previous generations. And if you've noticed, and not noticed that my setup is completely in a mess right now because my ASRock X370 Chi motherboard decided it was just going to literally crap itself, then you're on the right track. So if you looked around, you're interested in buying an X570 motherboard, which I guess I am now too, and you've looked around and you see some of these prices. And not only are these prices for a decent motherboard anywhere from $250 to $300 for a decent motherboard, that's insane. So we're going to go over today why that's so much of a difference compared to the last couple generations. I know what I'm talking about. I've bought stuff and built stuff. I've done builds for people for that price range. So we're going to talk about why they are so much more expensive. So a couple things first off to take note of. AMD, not really outsourced, but they didn't manufacture the X370 and X470 chipsets in-house. It really doesn't affect anything. The X570 chipset AMD manufactured, so they took control of that, and they are producing that and selling that chipset. Apparently, since this chipset supports PCIe Gen 4, it's a little bit more expensive, which is kind of understandable. So the chipset itself, one of the components that of course goes on the motherboard, controls some of the input and output of the CPU. Obviously, the CPU does the majority of that, but the input and output also is somewhat done through the chipset if you're completely unfamiliar with how motherboards work. So some of the parts and some of the PCIe lanes go through the chipset to the CPU. So obviously, with that having a higher bandwidth capacity, higher PCIe generation, it's of course going to be a little bit more expensive, so therefore that kind of got pushed onto the consumers. Other thing is, of course, that the wide range of PCIe Gen 4 support across the motherboard, whether that be just the regular PCIe lanes, requires a lot more innovation and a lot more wiring, not really wiring, but a lot more of R&D to produce something that's not, be one of the first of its kind, I guess, because PCIe Gen 3 has been around for a bit, so PCIe Gen 4 is totally new, so it took a lot more research and development for that to come along and come to fruition. So, next up, let's talk about something, a little bit of a background story, which is kind of important to understand this next part. So if you're unfamiliar, AMD, as I said, announced that they are going to be supporting the AM4 socket up until 2020. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind about this, though, is that the AMD is supporting the socket, not the motherboard manufacturers are supporting that motherboard. So for the X370 Chi that I updated my BIOS, hoping to support the new Ryzen 3000 series, and I was greeted by a lot of errors. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this happens, and then there's also some companies that just drop support altogether, and this would be for some of the 8 chipset motherboards, but the 8 chipset really hasn't come around or hasn't had a successor, so the A chipsets actually have picked up a little bit more value recently, but in particular some of the B350 chipsets are starting to show their age, because these many motherboard manufacturers that only charge $50 for a B350 motherboard are not going to spend the time and the investment to go through and write a new BIOS code to support all the new software, or not all the new software, all the new CPUs. Now, one thing to also keep in mind is when you have a $50 motherboard, I'm not going to lie, motherboard manufacturers are not going to put the most highest end components. And of course, after each CPU has to have its set bit of BIOS code that tells the motherboard how to interact with that CPU. And when you get those $50 motherboards and the $50, or $60 motherboards, they really cut out on the size of the BIOS chip, and therefore you can't really load a large amount of new updates on there. So that's another reason why they drop support, in case you want to know. Now, where this leads into where this video applies is that obviously some of these motherboard manufacturers were not really expecting to have Ryzen last this long, especially on the AM4 platform. I applaud AMD for the fact that they have continuously supported a socket, and probably will for the next 3 years to 4 years, which is quite impressive considering it's never been done before. So I applaud them for it, and good job on them. It's just the problem is some of these motherboard manufacturers, I honestly don't think expected it to last this long, and they weren't expecting it to go through. So when they put the cheap BIOS chips on there, it didn't really have the support for the new motherboards. Obviously with cheaper motherboards it's not really worth time and effort to go code the new BIOSes on there, so of course it runs into issues as well. Another consideration why these motherboards are so much more expensive is, if you're unfamiliar, the X570 chipset has a 15 watt TDP compared to, I believe, the 7 or 8 watt TDP that was on the X370 and X470 chipsets. Now these chipsets, as I said, act as a mini processor. They serve to kind of compress some of the PCIe lanes into a simpler stream. They also, and that's in really nice layman's terms, so preferably don't get on my case about that. But basically the chipset acts as a mini processor. It's a coprocessor. And the coprocessor, of course, generates heat, just like a normal processor, just like the Ryzen 3000, 3000, 2000, 1000 series. So I would assume there'd be a 4000 and so on, but you never know. And it generates heat just like any other CPU. And of course, when you get to a point where instead of going from, a 7 watt TDP chipset, you go up to a 15 watt TDP chipset, which is almost the same as some processors that you can buy in commercial grade products, it starts to, of course, require some impressive cooling. And these cooling solutions that some of these motherboard manufacturers have come up with are quite impressive. We've got some fans, some mini fans, which obviously has been stated before, has not really great durability, but the chipset fans, okay, are questionable, but some of these other motherboard manufacturers have gone through and done some extensive cooling, they've done passive cooling, they've done a long list. And so there was also a lot of research and development going into how to build a completely new cooler, how to build a completely new design so that it supports the TDP, because if you're unfamiliar, in my personal opinion, some of the X370 motherboards look identical to the X470 motherboards with some color changes, and that's just because they took the same pretty much design, switched out the motherboard, switched out the chipset, changed a couple things, and pretty much just copied and pasted. And now with the X570 motherboards, you're starting to see a whole new redesign, so it's a lot more expensive. If you've actually noticed, the X370 motherboards, when they first came out, were way more expensive than the X470 motherboards. The X470 motherboards were actually quite cheap in comparison, and if you really want to get a motherboard, that's what I might end up recommending. The X570 chipset has done completely redone. It's using the latest flagship technology, so therefore it's going to be a slight bit more expensive, and people like you that want to go buy a motherboard, heck, people like me that need a new motherboard because I've got a shrine over here for my dead PC, yeah, we are quite interested in purchasing an X570 motherboard for that PCI Gen 4, that future-proofing, but currently it just looks like it's a little expensive. And for me, someone that wanted to get a new camera instead of stop using these GoPros, update my setup, maybe move this desk over to the window, all this kind of stuff, I'm sprawled all over my desk with my backup computer, and that's what I'm currently using. So, if you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up. I've got a PC build, a Ryzen 3900X, and an RTX 2070 Super build coming up. If you're interested in joining that will be this upcoming Sunday if you're interested. If not, I hope you check out the channel if that's your kind of thing. And hopefully, if you're in the market of buying an X570 motherboard, hope you can find one, because I sure as heck hope I can. But thank you guys very much for watching. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys around here sometime soon. Goodbye.